Okay, so I've got another story here from another, I think it's a paper. It's called The Serpent's Pen. David Castleton blog. So I'm just reading it. I don't own any of this. I'll put a link in if you want to go and read it yourself. You'll be able to do. And for the UFO one, and the just thing before, I'll put the link in for that as well in the description. Right. Okay. It says the Highgate Vampire. Did a 1970s Nosferatu stalk a London cemetery? The Highgate Vampire. Oh, I've just read that. Sorry, it's just repeated. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, a series of bizarre events occurred in and around Highgate Cemetery in London. A number of sightings of phantoms and spectres, particularly of a tall, dark, cloaked entity with burning eyes, led to the speculation the capital had acquired its very own vampire. Reports soon came from Highgate of tombs being broken into, graves and bodies were desecrated, and black magic rituals allegedly performed. The vampire hunters claimed to have broken open coffins and plunged stakes into and even burned the corpses of the undead. Newspapers obsessed over the strange occurrences. TV programmes were made about the supposed nest of vampires in Highgate Cemetery, and those promising to root out this ancient evil were interviewed. On Friday the 13th March 1970, hundreds of would-be vampire hunters invaded the Victorian graveyard and engaged in a search for what was becoming known as a Highgate vampire. But did any sort of vampire exist? Who were these self-proclaimed vampire hunters, some of whom would dedicate years to trying to understand the phenomenon and to hunting the vampire down? And how could a late 20th century city be gripped by a panic more at home in the pages of a Victorian Gothic novel? It's time to pick up our stakes, grab our bulbs of garlic, and go off in search of the elusive Highgate vampire. The roots of the Highgate vampire, strange sightings in a decaying graveyard. Highgate Cemetery was a far more ramshackle place than it is now. Once one of London's most fashionable burial grounds, the graveyard. I won't be seen dead there. Sorry. The graveyard was by the 1960s overgrown and neglected. Graffiti was scrawled across headstones. Vandals had pulled doors off vaults. Cracks and holes in tombs offered glimpses of coffins and, in some cases, bodies. It's not surprising that the dilapidated grandeur of the cemetery was its ivy-entwined Gothic monuments would generate legends of hauntings and sinister creatures and draw those with an interest in the occult and the macabre. According to David Farrant, a young local man with a passion for the paranormal, the first murmurings about the strange beings began in the late 1969. Farrant claimed that he spoke to two people, an old lady who'd been out walking her dog, and a middle-aged accountant who told similar stories about what they'd seen in the cemetery. The old lady had been walking down Swans Lane, a road running through the graveyard, when she saw a tall, dark figure with glaring eyes that seemed to be floating towards her. She felt the air turn icy cold. The account had got lost in the vast cemetery. She felt the air turn icy cold. The accountant had got lost in the vast cemetery. A bell started to clang, and he walked towards the sound, hoping it might guide him out of the necropolis. Instead, as the bell tolled, he became aware of something behind him and noticed the temperature plummeting. He turned around to see a tall, dark figure that stared at him intensely before it vanished. Intrigued, Farrant decided to investigate by spending the night in the graveyard. Farrant said, "At first, I suspected it might be an animal or someone dressed up or messing about because all these stories about vampires were in the news. But around midnight, I caught sight of a figure about 7 feet tall. that appeared to be floating just above the ground. I saw its face and 2 points of intense red light. The area turned icy cold as if I'd stepped into a refrigerator. The figure seemed to be draining me of energy, and I felt I was losing control of my normal faculties. It felt like a vivid dream, like I wanted to wake up but couldn't. Realizing I was under intense psychic attack, I repeated mentally. Where am I now? I've lost where I'm up to now. I repeated mentally a Kabbalistic incantation used to repel evil forces. It disappeared, but I decided the reports were true. In February 1970, Farrant wrote a letter to the local newspaper, the Hampstead and Highgate Express, also known as the Ham and High, asking if anyone had seen anything similar. A number of people responded, saying they'd glimpsed the apparition in Highgate Cemetery and Swain Lane. These phantoms, though, were of a variety of descriptions, including a tall man wearing a hat, a ghostly cyclist, a lady dressed in white, a face grimacing through the bars of a gate, a person wading into the pond, and a pale gliding entity. There were also reports of the sounds of bells and voices calling. There was little coherence in the types of spectres people claimed to have seen. But another local man with an interest in the supernatural, Sean Manchester, was intrigued by what he read, and Manchester would soon make public his ideas about what the apparition in the graveyard might be. The legend of the Highgate vampire emerges. Though Farrant had never claimed that the figure he'd encountered was a vampire, well, he kind of did, didn't he? He said it was draining him, but whatever anyway. Sean Manchester had a little doubt that the genuine Nosferatu was stalking suburban North London. Manchester contacted Ham and Highgate on 27th of February 1970. The newspaper published an interview entitled "Does a Vampire Walk in Highgate?", in which Manchester outlined the theory to explain the monster's presence. Manchester alleged that a king vampire of the undead was buried in the graveyard. This vampire, who in life had been an aristocrat and practitioner of black magic in medieval Romania, had been transported to England in coffins, followed in the early... Wait a minute, that sounds like the plot to Dracula. Whatever, anyway. What was I up to? Followers in the early 18th century, the vampire had been interred on the site that would later become Highgate Cemetery, and his followers had purchased a house for him in London's fashionable West End. The reason for Highgate Vampire's reappearance, Manchester said, was that rituals recently carried out by Satanists in the cemetery had reawakened the evil presence. Manchester claimed to have spoken to local people who'd expressed vampiric activity. A schoolgirl, Elizabeth, I'm not even going to attempt that name, had seen the vampire when walking down Swains Lane. She began having nightmares in which something evil tried to come into her bedroom. Eventually, 2 wounds appeared on her neck, and she started to display symptoms of anemia. Manchester and Elizabeth's boyfriend filled her room with garlic, crucifixes and holy water, and her condition soon improved. Manchester spoke to another young woman called Jacqueline, who said she'd woken in the night to find something cold clutching her hand. The next morning she noticed deep tears in the flesh where she'd tried to force her hand free. Jacqueline and her younger brother soon developed a fascination that kept drawing them to the more dilapidated western side of the Highgate Cemetery, where Manchester suspected the vampire infection had occurred. Manchester claimed that after details about Highgate's vampire became public, many people contacted him, all describing a similar tall, dark being with blazing eyes. Could there have been any truth in these claims about the vampire and occult rituals in Highgate Cemetery? In his interview, Manchester didn't supply any proof to back up his ideas about vampires coming from Eastern Europe. He would later state this was part of the article was a journalistic embellishment, but in a book published in 1985, The Highgate Vampire, Manchester does mention a foreign nobleman's coffin being brought to Highgate. There, however, appears to be more solid evidence concerning the occult ceremonies Manchester believed were taking place in the graveyard. Farrant said that in Highgate Cemetery, he often found the discarded remains of Satanist rituals, stubs of black candles, satanic markings on the floor of tombs. In one small chapel-like tomb with a marble floor and stained glass windows, an inverted pentagram had been drawn on the floor. Like Manchester, Farrant felt such activities might have woken a long dormant presence. Farrant claimed his research showed that, though the dark figure had not been glimpsed for many years before, a rash of sightings in the 60s and 70s, people had seen similar entities in the Victorian epoch. According to Manchester, the police were well aware of black magic practices going on in the cemetery. It's worth pointing out that Farrant himself was a member of a group that used the cemetery for rituals, though pagan, Wicca ones rather than anything satanic. Farrant stated that his group never interfered with the graves or bodies, but as many of their rituals had to be conducted outdoors, they used the cemetery because it was a secluded open space. In the late 1960s and early 70s, saw a revival of interest in all aspects of mysticism and the occult, including paganism, Eastern mythicism. Is that it? Mysticism, sorry. Couldn't say it properly. Satanism, witchcraft, and teachings of Aleister Crowley. Not good. As well as the emergence of a number of less conventional Christian sects, it's clear that an overgrown and secluded place like Highgate Cemetery would offer these engaged in these more outlandish aspects of the resurgence and suitably atmospheric space to carry out the ceremonies. That made no sense, whatever. But little concerning the Highgate vamp was likely to stay secluded for long. The Highgate vampires' heads into the limelight. The Hampstead and Highgate Express continued to follow the vampire story, re-interviewing Farrant and Manchester several times over the next months. In an article published on the 6th of March 1970, Farrant said he'd found dead foxes in the cemetery, but couldn't work out how they'd died, though he thought a vampire might have been responsible. Manchester claimed he'd also seen foxes and suggested the vampire may have been using them as a food source. Soon it was alleged the animals had been found drained of blood and their throats ripped open. Reports of the Highgate vampire commotion soon reached the national and even international media. Articles appeared in the national press, television programmes were made by both ITV and BBC. Even the international news agencies, Reuters, I'm not sure how you say it, featured the case. The anxiety around Highgate's vampire was part of a growing obsession with such creatures in British society. A number of TV programmes and horror movies had focused on vampires. One film, the Hammer horror production Taste the Blood of Dracula, released in 1970, had actually been shot in Highgate Cemetery just a year before the Highgate vampire incident. Began. It's very interesting. More chillingly, on the night of the Halloween in 1968, an act of desecration was discovered in the nearby Tottenham Park Cemetery. Flowers had been taken from a grave and arranged in a circle with arrows pointing to a new grave, which was uncovered. A stake had been driven through the coffin lid and into the heart of the corpse. As interest in the Highgate vampire mounted, a rivalry grew between David Farrant and Sean Manchester, with each belittling each other's skills as an exorcist, and each stating that he would be the one to expel the spectre lurking in Highgate. A mass hunt for Highgate vampire. On the evening of Friday the 13th, March 1970, programme aired on ITV featuring Farrington Manchester, others claiming to have seen supernatural figures around Highgate. As Friday the 13th is an ominous day according to British superstition. This day is often chosen to broadcast programmes dealing with the occult. The programme even included live outside reporting from Highgate Cemetery. Within 2 hours of the programme being shown, hundreds of would-be vampire hunters began arriving in Highgate. They surged over the locked gate and walls of the necropolis, despite the efforts of the police officers to stop them. The vampire hunters, many armed with weapons, searched frantically among the Victorian tombs. These interviewed at the scene appeared to genuinely believe the vampire, saying they were determined to find the monster and put an end to its diabolical actions. The mob caught no vampire that night, though insisted they'd glimpsed a tall, dark figure. The anxiety and terror certainly seemed real. Manchester would later say Highgate vampire furore provoked panic and fear and disbelief on a scale which one might anticipate if an alien had landed from outer space. The collective imagination had no defence against what we unearthed back in the late 60s in Highgate. Farrant, meanwhile, is still unconvinced the spooky presence was Nosferatu, complained that the media hysteria and local superstition had turned the Highgate Cemetery into a vampire. Attempted exorcist. Right, sorry, I read that wrong. Attempt to exorcise Highgate vampire. Right. On that Friday the 13th, as the amateur vampire hunters swarmed over the cemetery, Manchester and some companions made their way to the entrance of one of the particular catacombs. Manchester had previously been led there by a sleepwalking girl who claimed to have been bothered by the Highgate vampire and had been exhibiting symptoms of similar to Elizabeth. Unable to open the door, the group used a rope to climb down into the catacomb. Through a window, they found themselves in a vault with several coffins, one of which, a sinister-looking casket made of nearly black wood, didn't seem to fit. Manchester and his companions performed an exorcism with holy water and garlic sprinkled salt around. A few months later, on Lammas Day, 1st of August, the charred, decapitated remains of a woman were found near the catacomb. Police suspected this mutilated corpse had been used in a black magic ritual. After this, both Farrant and Manchester seemed to become more active. Farrant was apprehended by the police in the churchyard next to the cemetery one night, clutching a crucifix and a wooden stake. Farrant was arrested, but the case against him collapsed when it came to court. Manchester and his followers, meanwhile, were led to a different family vault by a female psychic helper. After forcing open the doors, they found a black coffin similar to the one they'd seen in the catacombs. Manchester suspected it had been moved by the black magic devotees. Levered open the lid. It was only when we discovered in the putrid chamber of that catacomb, August 1970, that we did and looked upon the horrific countenance of what was inside. Manchester said that we had absolute confirmation of what we were dealing with. Manchester wanted to drive a stake through the body, but a member of his entourage persuaded him not to, as interfering with the remains was a crime in England. Instead, the group performed a ritual and used 7 crucifixes, 4 white candles, and 7 cups of holy water in a ceremony carried out by 4 men and women to banish the spirit of evil or evil presence, using the Latin formula news of spoken exorcism. did indeed bring signs of relief to many living in the area. Manchester says the ceremony officials then bricked up the vault with a crucifix and holy water left inside, but Manchester reflects the vault didn't remain bricked up for long. Farrant also attempted to deal with the Highgate vampire. Farrant and his group were also making efforts to deal with the strange presence. They decided to try and communicate with the entity and discovered its purpose. In Highgate Cemetery, they conducted a rituals using 2 circles, incense, candles and a medium. The first time they tried this, the press interrupted them. A year later, according to Farrant, another attempt saw the entity clasping the medium by the throat. We had to break the circle. The area turned cold. She felt she was being enveloped by blackness. She felt something was trying to strangle her. Farrant was now convinced the entity was malignant after hearing of the incident in which a sinister force had pushed people over in Swains Lane. He did more research. Farrant came up with a theory that the being wasn't a vampire at all, but an evil presence that travelled along ley lines. Well, vampires are evil presences, aren't they? But alright, whatever. The ley line began in Cumbria, I don't know. A part of the cemetery where the urns are kept and run across Highgate through 2 old public houses. Highgate Wood and blocks of flats built over a nunnery. Farrant claimed he found evidence of disturbing supernatural activities in these places. Some people he spoke to said they glimpsed a tall, dark figure. A manager in one of the pubs apparently saw the light of a horrific... A manager in one of the pubs apparently saw a sight so horrific it turned his hair white, and one of the flats built over the nunnery had to be exorcised. Sean Manchester hunts Highgate vampire down. Despite the ceremony that Manchester and his colleagues conducted in the tomb, any relief was short-lived. Manchester said strange occurrences failed to cease. More horrifying incidents ended any hope that we had quietened the disturbance with the mere spoken exorcism rite. Further vampiric outrages were to follow. About 3 years later, Manchester claims he had his associates discovered the same ominous black casket in the cellar of an abandoned and suitably Gothic mansion on the borders of Highgate and Church End. Manchester suspected the coffin had been moved there to avoid all the attention. The media and enthusiastic vampire hunters have focused on Highgate Cemetery. Manchester's group dragged the coffin out of the basement, up the stairs and into the grounds of the mansion. Manchester said dawn was about to break, starting to send spears of bright illumination into the macabre spectacle below. When the lid was removed, he beheld the same thing he had seen in August in 1970. This was now the earlier part of 1974. Our quarry this time looked even more exaggerated, even more distorted than I remembered it. Far worse than even that time in Highgate vaults. His burning, fierce eyes under many furrowed brows were stirring yellow at the edges with blood at red centres, unlike anything imaginable. The mouth was set in a cruel expression, the lips drawn back. Manchester drove a stake into the Highgate vampire. With a mighty blow, a sharpened shaft of wood impaled the creature's heart. We witnessed the body shell cave in and quickly turn a filthy brown, and that itself soon became a sluggish flow of inhuman slime and viscera in the bottom of the casket. As Manchester believed that cremation is recommended as the ultimate deterrent and prevention to the vampire's nightly wanderings, he and his followers then burned the coffin and what was left of the body. This took several hours, after which all that remained was a great scorch mark and some bones that needed to be ground down and cast to the four corners of the four winds of the earth. Following the exaggerated process, Manchester pronounced the Highgate Cemetery is purged. Magicians feud and aftermath of the Highgate vampire rumpus. Manchester claims to have destroyed the vampire. Manchester's claims to have destroyed the Highgate vampire did little to end the feud between him and Farrant. There had even been rumours that the two would meet in a magician's duel on Parliament Hill on Friday the 13th April 1973. But this never happened. In 1974, Farrant was jailed after being convicted of interfering with remains and vandalising memorials in Highgate Cemetery. Farrant asserted that the damage had been caused by Satanists rather than him, but both Farrant's imprisonment and rumoured duel served to keep the Highgate vampire in the public mind for several years. The quarrel between Farrant and Manchester dragged on for decades, with each claiming to be an expert exorcist while dismissing the other's abilities. Both spent many years investigating the paranormal phenomena, and both produced books, articles and websites and gave many interviews about Highgate vampire. The two men and their followers frequently sparred on social media. David Farrant died aged 73 in April 2019, but Manchester still works as an exorcist and bishop in the British Old Catholic Church. A conservative sect that broke away from the Roman Catholicism after slaying the Highgate vampire. Sorry, doing my best. It's not great, I know. Manchester maintains that he has destroyed dozens of bloodsuckers. One of these incidents apparently involved a secondary contagion from the Highgate vampire in Finchley's Great Northern London Cemetery in 1982. A bite from that infamous Nosferatu had corrupted the body of a woman called Louisa. Arriving at the cemetery, Manchester saw a spider-like creature about the size of a cat. He stalked it and felt sure he'd put an end. He staked it and felt sure he'd put an end to the pollution of the Highgate vampire for good. But the Highgate vampire, or whatever what it is, really had been laid to rest. Farrant thought not, and ominously, a number of sightings of tall, dark figures with burning eyes have occurred from the 1990s until the present day. One witness who claimed to have glimpsed the spook in 1991 said he was very tall, well over 6 feet in height, and very thin. He wore a long cape like a cloak and a top hat. His dress looked Victorian in style, and he appeared all in black. He also appeared to glide, and there was no sound. The ground was littered with leaves, yet I heard no sound from him. Are there any rational explanations for the incredible tale of the Highgate vampire? As colourful and dramatic as the accounts of Farrant and especially Manchester are, there are those of a sceptical turn of mind, like myself, who feel tempted to question the Highgate vampire narrative. Are there any explanations, social or cultural, psychological, that could account for the hysteria of bizarre events affecting North London in the 1960s and 70s? The Highgate vampire was a strange case, but below are some. I'm not reading that. This is already too long. It's half an hour long, and I'm just like stumbling through, and I'm not happy with it. But I'm gonna upload it, and I'm gonna upload it on its own. I've changed my mind. I was gonna do the UFO one and then this, but it's too long now. So I'll put them like part 1 and part 2. So anyway, tell me what you think, please, in the comment section. And in the comment section for the UFO one as well. I'd be very interested to know what people think about that. And I will put the links in as well, so you can go and read it yourself if you want, if you prefer. But other than that, I'm going to leave it there now because it's It's getting up to half an hour. But yeah, like I said, just tell me what you think. Have you heard of this case before? I heard of it on a TV show from the 1980s, this vampire one. It was on ITV. I think Michael Aspel presented it. I can't remember what the programme was called, but yeah, it's interesting anyway. I find it interesting. But tell me what you think. And if you want to give me a thumbs up, well, I don't know why you would, because of how badly I read it, but if you want to do, then please do. Anyway, thanks for watching, and bye for now.